different stuff here, mainly dealing with the new attitude of women and men at this time. Um, for basic here, we call this new morality, and you can tell here's a paramount picture, something going on here, and you can tell that both these couples are. Uh, the main story here is to tell you is that this couple here is married, hence conjoined by the hand, but they are also having affairs, whatever you want to call it. If you've seen The Great Gatsby, this is where Tom, even though he's married to Daisy, begins to have an affair with Myrtle, and where Daisy begins to kind of see Jay Gatsby in that different light. And so that was the idea of new morality, and you can kind of do what you wanted to. And so it's pretty interesting. It just talks about how ethics and typical marriage and things like that begin to slide. Now, where does it all come from? Following World War I and into the 1920s, we have a baby boom. That just simply means a rise in the birth rate. It happens after every war. It happens when the troops comes home. It just happens, okay? Now, the cult of domesticity was there as well, but a lot of these females, after having babies, felt maybe incomplete and felt that they should maybe go and do it. So the younger generation began to actually rebel against everything their parent had told them. And this new age woman is called the flapper. We can tell the flapper from a variety of things. Number one, the first thing is the bob haircut. In fact, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a book called Bernice Bobs Her Hair. That just means that she's doing this. Now, the next thing about the flappers were the length of the dress. You can see they're showing knees, and that's kind of risque at this time. And I know this is silly because you see things on TV and it's like, that ain't bad. Why they call them flappers, there were usually fringe in the dress, and when they danced, it moved. The next thing is just the cut of the dress. You have the neckline, and you have it sleeveless. The idea was to show off as much of skin as possible. You also have the gaudy or excessive jewelry. And then lastly, you have their new attitudes of flappers. These flappers would go into bars. They would go drink, which women were not supposed to drink at this time. Very, very taboo. And they would just kind of go along with the men and flirt. And so that is a flapper in itself. As I said, Bernice bobs her hair, and we're going to look something at that. F. Scott Fitzgerald, major critic of the 1920s. Gatsby is a wonderful example of that. All right? Now, with the 18th Amendment, the U.S. is voted dry, and Prohibition begins, right? So in 1919, we have this idea of Prohibition. So all I need you to have there for 18th Amendment is that Prohibition begins. Alcohol is outlawed. Now, not everyone was for this. In fact, the flappers, there was a group of them called the Crusaders, and they put things on their car like repeal the 18th Amendment, etc. And they didn't like it. So they're going to go and do their own little thing, and we'll come back to them in a second. Now the problem becomes, how can you step onto someone's private property and take something that they put their money into and dispose of it? Well, Congress had to pass something to enforce prohibition, and that is known as the Volstead Act. All right? The Volstead Act basically gave this is a federal detective. These are probably people who work for the federal detective. It gives him the right to enter private businesses and, with the assistance of the police, seize what they are deemed to be illegal. That would be the alcohol. And so here they're dumping it down the drains. And this was entirely legal, no problems. So what begins to happen is these breweries begin to, some of them went into the mountains and became moonshiners. Other ones started doing some other things. So let's talk about what that is and how a bootlegger works. They would make their whiskey, their whatever it is, and they bring it on a boat. And this is how a bootleg operation worked. The boat was here, and you had two cars, the unloading boat. The liquor is put into the second car. The first car is completely empty. These two cars would leave at the same time. If the police showed up, this car would begin to drive erratically and fast and do whatever else, while this one is going the speed limit. The idea is the police would chase this car down, leaving this car free to go, and getting the alcohol where it needed to be and making that money. So A bootlegger, a la Al Capone, who is the biggest bootlegger, correct? They are illegal distributors of alcohol. They're pulling a trick. If bootleg, you've possibly heard in a football term, would be where the quarterback fakes a handoff or fakes a throw and does the opposite. They'd either fake the handoff and throw it, or they'd fake the throw and hand it off. The idea is to catch the defense on that pump fake, on that fake, and then do something entirely different. Now, Al Capone, of course, is the most famous bootlegger. He was actually centralized out of Hot Springs. Believe it or not, he loved Hot Springs, Arkansas. He's been there. There's a ton of stuff that bear his name, etc. Chicago also was a favorite playground of his. There you are. All right. Now, where do they provide this alcohol? Because remember, you can't pull it up there. There existed secret bars, and these secret bars were called speakeasies. The last play we had last year, The Drowsy Chaperone, was about a speakeasy. In fact, they had a secret show. Some of you might have heard about it, and they had to give a secret word to get in. That's how a speakeasy essentially operated. You had a password, you had some type of code word that you would give to get in, and you could drink. These usually were underneath existing bars or existing places of different things. Now, if you notice here, every woman has short hair, bobbed, correct? These are flappers. This is what happened, okay? So they're speakeasies. Now, while in the speakeasies,
well, I've made Gnarls Barkley my life's work.
You can go look that later. The idea of that video there that I was getting ready to show you is that Gnarls Barkley and band CeeLo Green did where they put themselves in different times, and they were in a speakeasy. Now, while in a speakeasy, the music of choice, kind of the rap, the stuff that's pushed off and seen like this as being immoral, is jazz music. So jazz becomes the soundtrack of the 1920s. It is illegal, it's there. And so, much in the same way that we have 1920s being jazz, and we have the 1950s and 60s being rock and roll, and we have the 1980s kind of moving into what they called new wave, and how rap took over from the 90s to the 2000s, and how we have, gosh, whatever horrible music is now. Every generation has a soundtrack, and for the 1920s, it was jazz. All right. Now, I'm not going to get a lot about the jazz because that also touches on African Americans, so I'm going to save that for the next day when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance.